Just in the interest of time, just a couple of brief words about myself, so you know where I'm coming from experience-wise. I'm one of the partners in DLA Piper, an international law firm, heading up the renewable energy practice, and I have been working on corporate PPAs for the last up to 8 years, I think, now altogether. We're one of the practices that is most active in renewable corporate PPAs across Europe and internationally, having many international clients such as Amazon, Uniper, BASF, so right across the board, as well as many generators. I have worked on a number of zero subsidy and corporate PPAs across the energy community and outside of the energy community, and I will focus on that. However, the slides do have a few principles from the European UK market, simply because I want to talk about experience rather than sort of abstract concepts, and therefore you will see that I will bring in on a number of occasions experience from the European markets, which is much more developed on the corporate PPA side, but then basically lead on to the transaction in a form of case study that we've done across the energy community countries and other countries to show what the potential is and where we're heading in terms of trajectory. The important, I suppose, starting point is why we're actually talking about zero subsidy PPAs and what are the drivers for them. And there are really fundamentally two drivers, as Harald already mentioned. One is, in fact, the wish to obtain a long-term power price hedge for at least some of the volumes that are being purchased, and therefore the very first transactions in the market were, in fact, for instance, from Norsk Hydro, very much focused on the hedging element rather than the renewable energy element. However, it's fair to say that over the last 4 or so years, the focus is very much on the ability to use corporate PPAs for what's called Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 accounting. So the corporates being able to demonstrate that the power that they've purchased is renewable or predominantly of renewable source, irrespective of the grid average power that's taken off the grid. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation, but these are the two drivers: Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 accounting and price hedging. The types of PPAs that we're talking about, and you can find lots of different names in the markets, are fundamentally two. One is the concept of a physically settled power purchase agreement. So that means the power that's being generated is actually being nominated, scheduled, and sleeved. I'll talk about that concept in a moment as well. Into the balancing group or the supplier's balancing group of the off-taker. And then in contrast, the concept of a financially settled PPA, where in fact the power is being sold on the market, but guarantees of origin are being transferred, and the PPA still provides a CFD, or sort of a contract for difference-based financial hedge. So you can already tell that the concept of it being called a PPA is a bit of a misnomer, because it's fundamentally focused on providing a hedge against the as produced volumes or as nominated volumes of a wind farm or solar farm, and then the transfer of the environmental attributes. As I said, fundamental to in particular the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 accounting point is the underlying legal fiction that we have in the UK and in Europe under the Renewable Energy Directive, or retained EU law in the context of the UK, which gives you the possibility, even though the power that you take off the grid as a consumer at any given point in time has the grid average emissions that result from the power generation that at that point in time was connected to the grid and generated, can be treated as renewable if you use environmental attribute certificates in the form of in the UK, REGOs, in the EU, guarantees of origin, same in the energy community, and more internationally, based on international renewable energy certificates. Again, I'll talk about some examples a little bit later. The drive fundamentally for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 accounting is not just purely an accounting issue or the need to basically account for it, but it's actually fundamentally driven for a lot of corporates and for a lot of off-takers to achieve the ability to make certain claims. That is very recently now overlaid and further shaped by the Green Claims Directive that has just been finalized in terms of text form, where obviously there are certain restrictions around general claims and specific claims being made. I'm very happy to talk about that also in the Q&A, but fundamentally, the different drivers around reporting net zero carbon neutrality or 100% renewable consumption is driving the corporate PPA sphere. Talked about the standard to validate those claims. Again, they are very important also in the context of the evolving framework like the EU Green Claims Directive, or in the UK, the Competitions and Markets Authority's guidelines for green claims, or more internationally, in particular ISO standards and SPTI-based standards. So there's a whole field of obviously associated guidance or regulation that needs to be considered by the corporate for the purpose of making those claims. There is associated with that, obviously, a degree of risk in relation to greenwashing. There's been a very, very interesting case very recently in Ireland, where Budweiser has been fined by the advertising board in Ireland for making the claim, even though they had entered into financially and physically settled corporate PPAs, that their beer is 100% or is brewed using 100% renewable sources. We can, again, talk about this a bit more detail. It's a very interesting case in the context of the Green Claims Directive, from the perspective of, what can a customer expect if you enter into corporate PPAs? Obviously, a fundamental driver for corporate PPAs, therefore quite an interesting case to study. But here there's an overlay of these legal concepts that I was talking about a moment ago, this legal fiction of guarantees of origin being able to be used in fuel mix disclosure to claim that a certain amount of electricity is renewable, even though it's factually not renewable when you take it off the grid, and the overall context of what does that mean in terms of the expectation that customers have and how that needs to be communicated. I will not go in a lot of detail into these points because I think it lends itself more to the Q&A, but suffice to say that if you wanted to fully understand on one hand how you can support or create an environment for corporate PPAs happening as it was in the UK and Europe, and also in starting in the energy community countries and some other countries, then the whole chain needs to be considered, from the actual corporate PPAs to the actual why do you do it beyond the hedging point if you want to make corporate renewable claims, which, as I said, is the predominant driver for these. Another concept that I was very briefly talking about at the very beginning, when I introduced the two structures, physically settled and financially settled PPA, is the concept of sleeving. Sleeving means, in very simple terms, nothing else than the need either for practical or for regulatory reasons to actually not directly receive, if you like, the power from the generator, but the need to actually, through an intermediary, have these power volumes effectively scheduled into, for instance, the balancing group of your supplier, and then those to be integrated in your overall supply agreement. The reason, as I said, is many, or the reasons are many, in fact, that there is the overall regulatory regime regarding fuel mix disclosure, so applying this legal fiction that I was talking about in a moment in relation to guarantees of origin, REGOs or IREGs internationally. Also, the issues related to intermittency. So very often corporate PPAs require the off-taker to take all of the volumes generated irrespective of their consumption profile. Therefore, there is a greater intermittency and imbalance risk. Harald was talking about high price volatility. Obviously, that creates a risk for buyers, and therefore the need to basically find somebody in the middle, be it a trader or be it a supplier, that helps with mitigating those risks through balancing services agreement or sleeving agreements to help you effectively shape that into a profile that then can be used as part of your supply agreement. So in other words, the sleeving is the flip side of the coin to physically settled PPAs. We always make it very clear whenever we advise that it isn't just a PPA. You also need to obviously make sure that the sleeving arrangements and the supply arrangements you've got with your current supplier interact and dovetail, and the whole concept of sleeving and making sure that they do dovetail is of very fundamental importance to make zero subsidy PPAs work. I also very briefly talked about financially settled PPAs. I already said that technically it's a bit of a misnomer in the sense that you don't buy power under these arrangements, but what you do is you achieve, if you like, an equivalent situation by combining a transfer of guarantees of guarantees of origin or other environmental attribute certificates like IREGs, together with offering a hedge that you would otherwise have in a physically settled PPA scenario if you bought a volume for a fixed price. And here the idea is that you agree with the generator in very simple terms that you have a CFD, a contract for difference, not too dissimilar to the CFDs that are being offered in the subsidy regimes, insofar as the generator gets the benefit of the CFD if the market price is lower than the fixed price, and the buyer gets the benefit of the CFD if the market price is above the fixed price. So the idea being that the generator sells their as produced volumes in the day ahead and intraday market, and you create effectively a hedge for the generator against the market price when they sell the power, and you create a hedge for the buyer against the market price to the extent they are exposed to that under their supply agreements. It is in very simple terms, and I'm in the interest of time will not go into too much detail, but again, happy to talk through that in the Q&A. A financially settled agreement, therefore it's a financial instrument under MiFID, same in the UK under FISMA, same in the energy community country, or most of the energy community countries. In the energy community countries in particular, we obviously have, through the energy communities, target model of day ahead and short-term markets, a situation where most of the corporate PPAs are in fact for regulatory reasons in the form of a financially settled PPA. And as I said, they are fundamentally seen as financial instruments because they're CFDs, which brings with it a number of considerations in terms of A, the reporting, and B, the authorization or exemption. Typically, most corporates can be exempt under the ancillary activity exemption for those, but those points obviously need to be considered in the context of doing these transactions. Yeah, happy to talk through this in a bit more detail in the Q&A. I'll jump over these points. And I just want to depict very briefly some of the sleeving models that we have for physically settled zero subsidy PPAs. Again, I find it important that you don't just look at the PPA between the generator and the corporate buyer, but you actually consider the overall context of the transaction, including the transfer of guarantees of origin and the interaction of the PPA with your supply agreement, because typically the generator will not be in a position to provide all of your consumption as a corporate buyer. And therefore, you typically have a number of additional agreements. In this case, and this has been the most common sleeving model in the past. For physically settled PPAs, the generator and the corporate buyer entered into what's called a generator PPA. So that's your typical corporate PPA. And then the corporate buyers typically entered into a back-to-back PPA with their supplier, with the view that obviously from a settlement perspective, the generator directly nominates to the supplier's balancing group, or rather the generator's output is attributed to the supplier's balancing group in form of a sub-balance group, or sits within the supplier's balancing group for the purpose of the corporate PPA. And then those volumes are effectively then supplied as part of the overall supply agreement with the corporate buyer. But for that, these contractual arrangements need to be in place. There is obviously that there are different market scenarios, different market environments, and therefore you find variations of that classical, if you like, sleeving structure, where, for instance, as a variant, and I will talk to one or two more variants in a moment, you had the concept of a volume attribution. So compared to the back-to-back sleeving structure, you didn't have a corporate buyer and a supplier back-to-back PPA, but you just basically said that whatever's being nominated from the generator to you, supplier, is being volume attributed. The reason why suppliers have moved away from that concept to a degree is because of the price volatility that Harald was talking about at the very beginning. So obviously, if you volume attribute, then you usually have a disparity between the time of consumption, the time of production, and just attributing megawatt hours without reference to the actual market price at that point in time often exposes the supplier to greater price volatility, which they can't cover under the normal supply agreements. So that's why the structure is still being used, but not as predominant. You can get rid of, alternatively, the concept of a back-to-back PPA, which obviously takes a bit more time to negotiate with the supplier by bringing the supplier directly into the corporate PPA. So that's called the trilateral sleeving model, if you like. So again, an alternative to that arrangement. Reason why you don't necessarily always do that is also because it complicates the negotiations with the generator. And very often you may not want the supplier to basically see what price the generator is offering to you for commercial confidentiality and also cost reasons under your supply agreement. So that's why you sometimes see that trilateral structure, but not in all markets. And this is a structure now in terms of a volume-shaped structure, which has become much more prominent over the last couple of years because of the price volatility. The reason for this is that, as I said, most of the physically settled PPAs usually require the corporate buyer to take all of the output, which means that very often there's a great disparity between what the generator produces and what the corporate buyer consumes, which means that the supplier who takes then in this back-to-back structure, the volumes will actually end up having quite a lot of price volatility across the consumption profile, which obviously costs the supplier, and it may not actually be able to pass it through to the corporate buyer. And for that reason, quite a number of suppliers have started to say no, I'm not going to do I'm not going to do a back-to-back sleeving structure, but actually you, corporate buyer, can only effectively use corporate PPAs as part of your supply agreement if, in fact, those come already volume shaped, so in form of a base load structure or a profiled structure to me, so I don't have that volatility in terms of the actual consumption and production, and you need to find somebody else like a balancing service provider, an aggregator, a trader who's better placed to basically trade out those differences and provide a shape profile. So again, that's another variant of the sleeving model to deal with some of the issues that have come up in the market more recently. You can then do these structures obviously also cross-border. The interesting bit is that when you do them cross-border, because of market coupling, you very often get to a point where the structures are actually not too dissimilar to financially settled PPAs, because in essence you sell the power in the local market and you buy it back through the market coupling in the destination market. But the same principles that we were talking about in terms of sleeving do apply also to cross-border structures if you want to do them. I'd probably say that about 60% of the corporate PPAs that I've been working on were cross-border PPAs or had some form of cross-border element. So it is a relatively common structure to corporate PPAs across borders. Equally, because I said it is quite similar to a financially settled PPA, here you can see compared to the previous option, actually it's not very dissimilar in terms of the types of agreement you enter into. If you were to do a cross-border virtual PPA, same applies also for the same structure on a national basis, only that you get rid of one of the power exchanges in this picture, but fundamentally the types of agreements that you need to enter into are the same. What we talked about sort of the nature of virtual PPAs already, so I'll jump over that. But what I would like you to take away from this, if anything, is obviously there are different sleeving structures. Sleeving structures are driven by fundamentally the question of how far is a supplier willing to take volume-related risk and the difference between a produced profile as against the consumption profile of the corporate, and how do you then sort of bring that together in the different forms that I've just been providing. The next few slides show the different forms of PPAs from a physically settled perspective. In terms of their profile, there are three main profiles: pay as produced, pay as forecasted, or pay as nominated, also called, and the fixed band. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail. You will get these slides. You can look at them in a bit more detail, or happy to talk through some models in the Q&A. But fundamentally, the important thing to understand is that these different types of PPAs have different consequences, in particular for who takes the imbalance risk and how do you deal with the BRP arrangements, and therefore the PPAs aren't the same, but they are in fact fundamentally different in terms of the way they're being drafted and in the way risks are being allocated. This slide shows effectively the interaction of contract terms in terms of also bankability related mitigants, because most of these corporate PPAs are being used to finance new generation facility, coming back to the overall aim of how do you increase renewable energy generation in the context of where the support schemes do not yield attractive prices, or where in the overall context you would like to do a corporate PPA for greenhouse gas protocol scope 2 accounting. Again, without going into too much detail, the point really being that you do have quite a number of potential lower delivery scenarios, which obviously all need to be reflected in the PPAs in the same way they are reflected in CFD arrangements, for instance. But there are different remedies, and obviously you need to size them so that they actually fit the particular generation profile. There's obviously range from liquidated damages to availability guarantee payments to cover, say, a purchase compensation. So again, key point to take away here is different ways in which you can deal with reduced capacity, lower delivery, for an intermittent generation like renewable sources, and all these need to be reflected in those corporate PPAs. Equally, you have the same issue when it comes to typical events that impact fundamentally the operation of the agreement, because it's a long-term, usually 10 to 15-year agreement. And how do you allocate those risks? And one thing to take away from this slide is basically that with the full lines, you can see that there are some risks that are always sitting with the seller or always sitting with the buyer. And with the dotted lines, you can see risks that sometimes do sit with seller, sometimes do sit with buyer, depending on the negotiation price and the type of the project. So again, here, very substantial flexibility in terms of drafting terms, which also makes sometimes corporate PPAs more attractive compared to the more rigid contractual terms that you have under subsidy regimes for renewables. This talks just about sort of the overall compensation, considering the point that you need to take the value of the guarantees of origin, so the environmental attributes, into consideration. And the calculation typically, obviously, for seller loss and buyer loss is different, because there are different objectives for both seller and buyer in this context. So again, just to take that away as a fundamental principle. Environmental attributes, a very important topic. Again, I said at the very beginning, especially now in light of the, the sort of the overall framework is starting to get much more defined around green claims and greenwashing. What you can do with current GOs, naming rights, future environmental attributes, also with the context of more granular reporting. So you basically do 24/7 matched consumption with production, and all of these tend to be a very thorny negotiation issue, demonstrating again that most corporate buyers actually do these PPAs not purely for hedging purposes, but predominantly for the benefit of the environmental attributes that they get through these PPAs. Just very briefly, in the interest of time, I talked about different ESC regimes. This is just a slide sort of showing different arrangements. There is obviously the overarching ECS regime. There are also some of the countries shown in red here are now moving to ECS, notably Poland. We have circumstances where, although there's no overarching agreement between the energy community countries and the EU, transfers are technically possible between, for instance, the Netherlands and Serbia via the EIB hub, even though there is no mutual recognition from a regulatory perspective. Again, happy to talk through that in a bit more detail in the Q&A, but suffice to say, it isn't just one concept, but there are very, very different concepts for environmental attributes. And then if you move further afield, for instance, Turkey as an example, you then get to the point of IREX being available for corporate PPAs. We've done a couple of examples there for Amazon, for instance. So the principles are fundamentally the same, but it's just moving into those areas at the moment, and there's still some limitations on the usability of those environmental attribute certificates in a cross-border context if you're not in the European ESCS market. So therefore, obviously, also there are still some limitations in relation to the flexibility of supporting the take-up of corporate PPAs if you only have a local market that you can tender to, because as I said, most of the corporate PPAs we're working on are actually cross-border. I do like this slide quite a bit because it just demonstrates how in the last 25 years, if you like, the market has changed quite drastically with the first start of the draft of the first Renewable Energy Directive in 2000, and the Preußen-Elektra decision being the first sort of seminal decision on the European level, looking at the concept of guarantees of origin, to where we have been last year and this year. I mentioned, I think at the very beginning, very briefly, the case of Iceland, where Iceland was suspended last year by the EIB. We were, it so happens, advising the EIB on this suspension and on the conditions to lift the suspension. The reason there was basically Iceland, by way of example, had sold all of their GOOs to continental Europe, but at the same time, all corporate energy-intensive customers were claiming that their energy is a 100% renewable source. So there were issues around double counting. So what you can take away from this slide is that it isn't, and it very much underpins the discussion around change in law provisions. It isn't just a static environment. Lots of things do change, often in a relatively short period of time, very fundamentally impacting corporate PPAs, and therefore a robust regime that tries to take on board those changes in the way they affect, for instance, the transfer of the environmental attributes, the use of those attributes, pricing, etc., is fundamentally important to corporate PPAs. I've already talked about environmental attributes, I think, to a degree. It's probably fair to say, just to finish this discussion off, also in the context of discussions that we currently have in relation to CBAM and electricity exported into EU from third countries, which are covered by the CBAM, that in some cases environmental attributes are not on their own eligible. So that's the case for CBAM. There is a PPA exemption, but also a clarification from the Commission. You cannot just use environmental attribute certificates. So there's often a combination of having to demonstrate some form of chain of custody or nomination chain plus guarantees of origin plus a contractual arrangement like a corporate PPA to make a claim. But environmental attributes are not necessarily just GOOs. You can demonstrate the transfer of them in lots of different ways, which again also impacts the discussion we had very briefly in the context of making green claims and misrepresentations. Very briefly talked about the European ECS scheme. I think it's probably just also worth flagging and also quite relevant for the energy community countries, that despite the fact that there is, even in some countries, a common sort of ECS rulebook that defines quite or harmonizes the issuance of and use of guarantees of origin, there still are deviations in terms of transfer, the ability to use, cancel them, hold accounts in a registry. So also just to keep in mind that even the ECS rules are not the same, but they just lead to a degree of harmonization, but still a degree of difference across the GOO schemes. I think we've already picked up quite a lot of the trends. As I said, the market is still going strong. It's very much picking up in the energy community countries, or at least for our work, it has been. Credit has become increasingly an issue because we're moving into a market where we had lots of very large corporates with good credit positions picking up power under corporate PPAs, and we're now sort of moving into the mid-market where it's increasingly difficult for generators to get financing on the back of the balance sheet of those mid-tier corporate buyers. Hence, also the proposal on the European level and on national levels to create guarantee regimes and multiple offtake possibilities. So increasingly, we have multiple off-takers on the corporate PPAs because the buyers themselves are not big enough to take all of the volumes. Financially settled PPAs have grown quite substantially, especially in the energy community countries for the reasons I explained, i.e. the target market model. We see a diversification of structures, some alternative structures emerging. For instance, Volkswagen very much does not use physically settled, financially settled PPAs solely. They also use long-term purchase of GOOs with a fixed price there as an alternative. Then we talked about the sleeving structures and sleeving models, so don't need to go into that in more detail. Standardization is key. I myself have drafted the EFFET PPA for the EFFET Legal Working Group, also now for Germany, a PPA that will be released by DENA very shortly. And ISTA is also showing signs to wanting to standardize, but also in that process, you can see how far you can go with standardization. And there's still very often lots of structures that are not very prone to standardization and need particular models in the market to make it work. Corporate PPAs get increasingly connected with topics like provision of ancillary services, redispatch models, battery storage co-located. We also see an issue in the market around the sleeving structures or the lack of sleeving structures. So there are quite a lot of corporates that have just focused on entering into corporate PPAs and have neglected dealing with the sleeving structures, which will come in a year or two to be a fundamental problem for most of them, because they will realize that they won't be able to sleeve their corporate PPAs in the way that they perhaps thought they would when they entered into the corporate PPA. So again, just making the point that I made earlier, that we need to effectively look after the sleeving structure as much as the PPA when you negotiate them. Negative pricing has also become an area that's much more nuanced in terms of the treatment under corporate PPAs. We have seen tightening criteria for instance, from V100 in relation to the use of environmental attribute certificates under certain circumstances. I mentioned the AIB Iceland case that we were involved in. And there's also a significant drive for 24/7 reporting, also somewhat driven by electrolyzer PPAs, which obviously at the moment don't need, but in the future will need more granular reporting. And all of that sort of in a trend moves us more towards structured PPAs for particular scenarios. I want to finish off very briefly with 3 cases, which in fact do relate to structures that we have seen in the energy community countries. And I've personally been involved in, for instance, structuring a transaction for Shell in Albania, or a transaction involving Cargill for wind in Serbia, and Albania was solar. Those have been financially settled PPAs. They have been cross-border in both cases, with the ability to subsequently transfer those Albanian or Serbian guarantees of origin eventually into the European market. They're both financially settled. One is for a structure that is for the unsupported part of a facility. The other one is effectively a fully corporate PPA together with a route to market arrangement for 2 wind farms in Serbia. So just demonstrating that the models that I have been talking about in terms of financially settled PPAs are working. They're also working in the context of both part supported, unsupported, or fully unsupported power. Equally, the structure that you see on screen for H&M has been replicated in non-EU and non-energy community countries, Turkey and Israel being one of them, again, on the basis of the use of IREX. So again, demonstrating that there is sort of a move of bringing these structures, in this case, this portfolio structure that they initially used in the European market, into non-European markets in a similar form, just with different types of certificates, and obviously a bit more shaped to the actual market model in terms of the ability to sell and purchase power and sleeve that power, and the same obviously for the energy community countries. But you see from those case studies that I've got on screen, H&M, BASF for electrolyzer PPA, and the development of physically and financially settled PPAs in a standardized form, is that we are moving to transactions not just in Europe, but across the board. It looks at implications like usability of PPAs under the CBAM, the different structuring using energy community, GOs, or, as I said, IREX, the context of Turkey or other countries that are covered by IREX for the purpose of corporate PPAs. Yeah, and sort of seeing those models being replicated by corporate buyers with the necessary changes made to accommodate the local environmental attribute regime and the local market regime for the purpose of buying the power and sleeving the power. And maybe I think I should be relatively close to my allocated time, so I'll stop here. Hope that was interesting and insightful in terms of a very quick run through corporate PPA structures. If there are any questions, happy to take them now. You will get the slides, and otherwise on reflection, if you have questions later on, also happy to answer them over email.